Qatar was an isolated, impoverished, and underdeveloped backwater for basically all of human history until things finally began changing when oil happened to be discovered in 1939 across the Dukan Field here found across the westernmost edge of the peninsula. The same year it was discovered was the same year that World War II began, so it was never really developed until a decade later in 1949. By the 1950s, Qatar was producing a modest amount of oil from this field, but it paled in comparison to the gigantic oil fields that had been found nearby across Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And that pushed Qatar and their partnered Western oil companies to begin searching for offshore oil reserves around the peninsula within their territorial waters in the Gulf. These oil reserves were still fairly small. They were but a quarter of the reserves found in Kuwait in the United Arab Emirates. Qatar wanted to strike it big like the rest of them, and so they kept on searching for more. And then in 1971, they would finally end up making the geologic discovery of the century. And it wouldn't even be oil. With the assistance of Shell, what they ended up discovering was this: a big offshore natural gas field in the middle of the Persian Gulf, split roughly 60-40 between their own exclusive economic zone and Iran's. Their side of the field became known as the North Field, while Iran's became known as the South Pars Field, and its discovery would ultimately change both countries' destinies forever. Because this field is by far the largest natural gas field ever discovered in the world. It is so enormous that the Qatari side of the field alone contains an estimated fifth of all the entire world's natural gas reserves. This single field overnight catapulted little Qatar into the number 3 position in the world for natural gas reserves, just behind Iran and Russia, and nearly double the natural gas reserves found across the entire United States. Its discovery would one day transform Qatar into the financial and economic juggernaut that we know it as today, and it is the primary source of Qatar's OP status on the world stage. Back at that time in the 70s, the natural gas industry was completely different than it is today. Natural gas is, of course, a gas, and that means it takes up a lot of volume. Exporting natural gas to somewhere else while it's still in its gaseous state takes up a lot of space, and that means that exporting the gas by ship is incredibly inefficient and doesn't make any financial sense. This is why the liquefied natural gas, or LNG business, was born shortly after the Second World War. By converting natural gas into a liquid, it takes up only 1/600th of the same volume it does when it's in its gaseous state. The problem with LNG has always been that it's the most expensive way to transport natural gas, because of all the complicated and advanced infrastructure that needs to be put in place to get it all running. And worse, in the 1970s, there was nowhere near enough of a market or a demand for LNG. Europe received plentiful, cheaper gas from pipelines coming in from places like Russia, Norway, and the Netherlands, meaning that expensive LNG was not going to be competitive there. But the increasingly advanced and developing island economies of East Asia were a completely different matter altogether. Japan, in particular, is an island nation that is bereft of fossil fuels, meaning that as their economy developed and their demand for gas increased, their geography was better suited towards importing gas as LNG from container ships rather than through long pipelines built across or beneath the ocean. The same became true of Taiwan and eventually South Korea as well, which effectively functions as an island as well for the purpose of importing energy from abroad because of North Korea and the ocean to their other 3 sides. All 3 of these rising East Asian economies' demand for LNG began to grow over the years, and at first, their demand was almost entirely met by nearby producers in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. This was the world that Qatar and Shell found themselves in 1971, when they suddenly discovered the biggest natural gas field in the world. Building up an LNG industry from scratch was thought to be too costly and too risky, and building out long pipelines to markets in Europe was just too ridiculous and expensive to even consider. They had both hoped that their discovery was oil because, unlike natural gas, oil is naturally a liquid, and so it's far less costly to just load it up on tankers and ship it around the world. So rather than developing Qatar's natural gas in the North Field, Shell abandoned the project, and with global oil prices skyrocketing following the Arab oil embargoes in the 70s, Qatar continued to focus on its smaller oil reserves for the next 20 years. And then, in 1986, the price of oil unexpectedly crashed by more than 50%. Production and revenue from oil sales in Qatar crashed alongside it, and the Qatari economy, which almost entirely relied upon selling oil at the time, was put into a crisis mode. By the 1990s, with oil prices and revenue still low, the Qataris began turning their attention back towards all of that natural gas. Global demand for natural gas was beginning to increase. Natural gas emits 50% less CO2 than coal when it's burned for energy, and about 30% less than oil, while releasing less air pollution as well, making it a desirable and slightly cleaner fuel to use for electricity for nations weary of climate change and pollution. And at the same time, the costs of building out LNG infrastructure had dramatically come down after more than 20 years of continuous technological developments and understanding. Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani strongly believed in the potential of the natural gas reserves in the North Field, and in the growing LNG business. The Qataris and their partners set out to build no less than the largest and the most competitive LNG business the world had ever seen. They constructed the largest artificial harbor in the world for their Ras Laffan industrial city, and by 1996, Qatar was exporting their first shipments of LNG through the Strait of Hormuz and abroad to global markets. It would end up revolutionizing both Qatar and the entire world in the process. South Korea became their single largest customer, and they still continue to purchase roughly 27% of their entire natural gas supply from Qatar alone. And the vast revenues that these countries were paying for Qatari LNG flooded back into the coffers of the Qatari government. This is a chart of the gross domestic product per capita in Qatar from 1987 to the present. This year, 1996, is when Qatar first began exporting LNG to the world market, and you can clearly see how immediately afterwards, their wealth began to absolutely skyrocket to the point in 2006 where they became the largest LNG exporter in the world. All of this newfound wealth came with a problem. Qatar was growing too overdependent on a single source of income. If the business were to ever crash or run out of supplies, Qatar would be forced into going back to the impoverished, empty peninsula that it had been for thousands of years beforehand. And so in order to diversify their income streams and secure their future, they began investing into other businesses, ideas, and avenues. Qatar Airways was founded in 1993 and expanded with the LNG and oil money to become one of the top 10 largest airlines in the world today. The Qatar Sovereign Wealth Fund was established in 2005 as a means to invest their massive revenues into projects, real estate, and companies abroad to the point where today, the fund's assets are nearly equivalent to the entire annual GDP of Egypt. They also founded the state-owned Al Jazeera media group, translating from Arabic into English as literally the peninsula, the Qatar Peninsula. But Qatar still had a low natural population base. In addition to being located in a dangerous geopolitical neighborhood, Qatar shared the largest natural gas field in the world with Iran, which meant that each of their governments had to collaborate together and remain friendly to an extent in order to safely and mutually extract all of the gas there. Qatar's solution to defending themselves in this precarious geopolitical neighborhood was by simply aligning itself very closely to the United States. Qatar invited both the American and British militaries to assist in constructing the Al Udeid Air Base in the country, which eventually went on to become the US military's largest base in the entire Middle East, with more than 11,000 total personnel and more than 100 operational aircraft as of today. And beyond that base, Qatar also supplied enormous quantities of energy supplies to many of America's most important allies in Asia: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and India. Qatar's low population base of only a few 100,000 people also proved to make it difficult to actually use all of that money from LNG and petroleum to build things like skyscrapers and stadiums for the World Cup. And so to solve that problem, Qatar began encouraging enormous migration to the country for low-skilled workers. This is why today, Qatar's demographic structure is one of the strangest and the most exploitative in the entire world. Nearly 9 in 10 people in the country today are foreign workers without any citizenship who have recently moved to the country from abroad. Since the overwhelming majority of the foreign workers who have come to Qatar are also men, Qatar's gender profile is by far the most lopsided in the world, with roughly 3 men in the country for every 1 woman. South Asian men would be promised by Qatari officials of high pay and good conditions and then lured to the country, where they would then often have their passports confiscated and, with no way to leave, forced into much lower paying labor jobs with much worse conditions than they had initially been promised. That is simply unacceptable, and it is a dark stain on Qatar's success story and the World Cup in general. After an investment of more than $250 billion in into their own LNG industry, Australia suddenly surpassed the Qataris for the #1 largest exporter of LNG at the end of 2018, and the United States wasn't very far behind them, with billions worth of investments into the industry of their own. Australian and American LNG were suddenly competing with Qatari LNG for market share across Asia. The Qataris decided to double down. In 2019, they announced a $30 billion plan to expand their LNG production from the North Field. The plan was that Qatar's LNG exports would be increased by nearly 2/3 by 2026. Where would all the excess Qatari LNG go to? The Asian market's demand was already largely being met. North America was growing increasingly energy independent and less reliant on imports. And Europe hardly bought any LNG at all, with most of their gas demand being met by the Russians, Norwegians, and Algerians through their pipelines. And then, of course, everything changed when the Russians invaded Ukraine and the Europeans began to cut out all of their gas imports from Russia. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a brand new, enormous market for LNG that is roughly the same size as Asia's market opened up to the suppliers, and Qatar immediately became one of the best positioned to capitalize on it. There is perhaps no other country in the world that'll benefit more from Russia's invasion of Ukraine than Qatar. A flurry of high-ranking European Union and German energy executives have now been flying back and forth with Doha to discuss new LNG contracts and shipments. And now the Qatari economy is expected to grow by more than 4% this year alone. With Russian gas now being completely locked out of the European market, LNG replacements from elsewhere will be highly in demand and competitively priced. And Qatar is currently estimating that at least half of their ongoing LNG expansion in the North Field will now be headed straight for Europe by 2026. Ensuring them billions of dollars a year in extra revenues from today. Qatar's newfound wealth has also come with newfound ambitions and abilities to influence the world around them. Since they share the largest natural gas field in the world with Iran, Qatar has always maintained that fairly close working relationship with them out of necessity. Following the Arab Spring revolutions that swept across the Arab world in the early 2010s, Qatar and Saudi Arabia nearly always found themselves supporting the opposite sides in every conflict all throughout the region. By 2017, the Saudis had had enough of their conflicting ambitions, and all on the same day, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Djibouti, Senegal, Mauritania, the Comoros, the Maldives, and the Saudi-supported Tobruk-based government in Libya, as well as the Saudi-supported Hadi government in Yemen, all announced the severing of their diplomatic relations with Qatar. Saudi Arabia and the UAE went another step further by also shutting down all of their ports to Qatari-registered ships, and shutting down all of their airspace to the state-owned airline, Qatar Airways. The Saudis also shut down their entire land border with Qatar, effectively transforming the country into an island state. And then, to make Qatar's isolation even more permanent, the Saudis even proposed digging a canal across their entire land border and filling it in with water from the Persian Gulf. They made several demands of Qatar in order to lift the blockade, including that they shut down Al Jazeera, reduce their diplomatic relations with Iran, agree to reparation payments and 10 years of monitoring, and to align themselves fully with the geopolitical interests of Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. Naturally, Qatar refused all of the demands, and the economic consequences of the Saudi-led blockade over them immediately became apparent. Qatar Airways had relied extensively on both Saudi and Emirati airspace for a significant amount of their routes, and nearly overnight, they had to suddenly change all of their flight paths to longer and more costly routes to avoid both countries entirely, until January of 2021, and it largely only ended out of the Saudi regime's own desire to rebrand their image with the incoming Biden administration over in the United States. Many figures in Washington had been frustrated with the blockade for years, because both Saudi Arabia and Qatar are nominally strategic allies of the United States.